Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle and this is my 51st video discussing British science fiction. In this video I'd like to look at an American book series for which I was responsible for the mainly British content. In 1984, following Ron Turner's retirement from full-time work for the UK's leading weekly comics publishers, he was open to accepting private commissions. On learning of this, I'd linked up with his new agent John Lawrence to commission Ron to illustrate our own small press comic books, GRF Presents, featuring a new space hero, Nick Hazard, which I created for him based on some of Fern's stories, of which I was now the copyright holder. And I also obtained permission to adapt E.C. Tubbs' stories, beginning with Calgon the Golden. But when we tried to expand and shift our operation into the American market, we fell victim to a fraudster and had to call a halt, losing a lot of money. We were not able to publish The Golden Amazon in comic book form, although this edition was eventually published a few years later by a UK small press. Now, back to promoting John Russell Fearn's work in book form. In 1986, I'd managed to sell reprint rights to the book edition of Conquest of the Amazon. That's the original edition, and it was reprinted in that edition, along with one of his Sky and Westerns, Skeleton Pass. The publisher was Trojan Books, a UK mass-market instant remainder publisher. Trojan was the brainchild of one of the sons of the Pemberton family, whose various imprints had flourished during the post-war boom in British paperbacks. This edition, a reprint of the Orbit book, used a recycled cover from a 1983 UK reprint edition of Sharon Green's Jarlav Amazon Warrior, and so unfortunately didn't actually illustrate Fearn's story. However, the Trojan editions had a large print run and excellent distribution nationwide in Woolworths and other stores, and so served my purpose at the time in keeping the Amazon in circulation. From all of his many characters, the Golden Amazon was the personal favourite of both Fearn and his wife, and before she died, I'd given my word to Mrs. Fearn that I would use my best endeavours to restore the entire saga to print. It was a promise I was determined to keep. Time passed. The Amazon still lived on in the faded memories of book collectors, but even most of them were unaware that Fearn had published so many additional Amazon novels in magazine form, other than the first 7 that had appeared in book editions. Before her death, Mrs. Fearn had entrusted to my safekeeping the only surviving manuscript copy of Duel with Colossus, an unpublished Amazon novel. Then, after her death, I discovered a second unpublished Amazon manuscript in Fearn's effects, entitled Lords of Creation, so there were now 26 books. To publicise The Golden Amazon, I decided to issue a chapbook of the next novel that had not so far appeared in book form. Maurice Flanagan of Zardoz Books published a nicely produced chapbook limited edition of the 8th novel, Lord of Atlantis, Xeon Books 1991, with a new colour cover and a back cover illustration by Ron Turner. I also wrote an introduction giving the first detailed history and chronology of the Amazon series and revealed the existence of the 2 unpublished Amazon novels. My hope was that some other publisher might pick up on this. The publisher turned out to be Gary Levisi, who lived in Brooklyn, New York. I'd been a contributor to Paperback Parade since 1991 and had met him when he came to London in October of that year to attend the first UK vintage paperback and pub fair organised by bookseller Maurice Flanagan and his friend Peter Chapman. That's my daughter and Tub at the 1991 book fair. And then later, as I'll be discussing, I met Gary in New York, along with his friend Chris Eckhoff. These are the sort of articles I was contributing to Paperback Parade. Fern, Tub, UK paperbacks, generally. Over the next few years, Gary and I kept in touch by correspondence, and I continued to write articles for his magazines, as we've seen. Late in 1994, following my article in Paperback Parade number 33, detailing Fern's Martian quartet of novels, following that article, Gary asked me if he could reprint those 4 books in his fledgling Gryphon Books imprint. I readily agreed terms, which included my commissioning new artwork and illustrative colour covers by Ron Turner. I promised my daughter Claire a holiday in the USA the following summer if she was successful in gaining her MA in her university examinations, which she duly did. So, in the sizzlingly hot summer of 1995, we flew to New York. And Gary had pulled out all the stops to get all 4 of the Emperor of Mars novels published in time for our arrival. We see them here. We'd arranged to meet the following day, and I was immensely impressed not only with the books, but with Gary's enthusiasm and enterprise. We got on so well that by the time Claire flew home at the end of the week, Gary and I had verbally agreed contracts for an entire series of Gryphon books, which became the Gryphon Science Fiction Rediscovery series, for which, for an agreed flat fee, I would provide each book and a new introduction, along with new Ron Turner covers, as well as more Fern titles. There would be new and reprint material by E.C. Tubb, whom I also now represented. On my return to England, I made the big decision to take voluntary early retirement and quit my career in local government. Henceforth, I would work for myself as a full-time writer and literary agent. I bought a computer out of my redundancy money, intending to work from home as the Cosmos Literary Agency. I had to suffer the indignity of enrolling in a local technical college course to learn how to use a computer, suffering the embarrassment of being the only old man in a class of very young women. After completing a handful of painful lessons, thankfully, I managed to learn just enough to be able to quit. Included in our first batch of contracts was a trial balloon reprinting of The Golden Amazon. Gary's 1996 edition constituted its first ever American book edition, and within 3 months of it coming out, Gary asked me to ready the second book in the series, The Golden Amazon Returns. I'll be showing and discussing the entire Golden Amazon series that was published by Gryphon Books in my next video, number 52. Meanwhile, in this video, I'd like to take a look at the many other remaining titles in the Science Fiction Rediscovery series. The Amazon titles were interspaced by many other titles by Fern, Tubb, and other American writers that we wanted to see in print. They included much material published in book form for the very first time, notably the early pulp novels of Jack Williamson and Don Wilcox's legendary The Whispering Gorilla. Now, one of the joys of being involved in this series was being in personal touch via email with both Jack Williamson and Don Wilcox. Our UK authors included the late John Russell Fern and E.C. Tubb, who was still very much alive and still writing. And towards the end of the run, I added other writers, including John Glasby, to my roster of agency clients. Glasby was to provide 5 Gryphon books, 4 of them new works, continuing Fern's Amazon series. I'd corresponded briefly with Fern before his death in 1960, visiting and befriending his widow for some dozen years before her death in 1982. As well as being bequeathed Fern's copyright in a will, I'd also to gather together all his surviving papers and correspondence, so I knew more about his work than anyone else. And as a friend of Tubbs for more than 30 years and now his agent, I knew his work equally well. John Glasby also became a good friend and my most prolific client. Via emails, I was able to run my draft introductions to the Gryphon books by Williamson and Wilcox for their approval, inserting their answers to my queries and speculations about the work in question. This correspondence makes these editions uniquely authoritative. I was able to unearth and present entirely new information about the stories. There were world-first editions for Williamson's novels and The Whispering Gorilla, and many of the Fern and Tubb books were previously unpublished novels that also became world-first editions. Unfortunately, Ted Tubb was not online, but we kept in regular contact by letter and telephone and met frequently at London book fairs. Another thrill was the opportunity to work closely with the legendary British artist Ron Turner. Working again via his agent John Lawrence, I commissioned Ron to paint exciting new illustrative covers for each Gryphon book. There's no doubt that his dynamic artwork contributed no small way to the success of the series. Let's take a closer look at some of these books published mainly between 1994 and 2004. Gary always paid well for the books and artwork, but at first couldn't afford to give the books full colour laminated card covers like regular trade paperbacks. But he solved the problem very nicely. He solved the problem by creating his own dust wrappers. See here, colour dust wrappers. But by 2001, after the first 35 titles with the dust wrappers, he'd found a more economical printer, and thereafter all these books did have full colour laminated card covers, giving them a more professional appearance. Laminated covers. The opening set of the Mars Quartet, we've already discussed that in my video number 27, Mushroom Pioneer. Now, Aftermath 1996 was a world first edition book of the lead novel in the fall 1945 US pulp stalling stories. We see it here with a striking cover by Earl Berger and inside illustrations for the novel were by Leo Morey. This was a fine action-packed novel imagining the surprising impacts on the Earth after a devastating war that's caused an increase in animal intelligence by weakening the heaviside layer. See the editor's caption there. Weakening the heaviside layer and letting through increased cosmic rays, cosmic radiation, which mutated all the animals on the Earth. Fern had sold the book rights at the time of writing in 1944 to his UK publisher Wordsworth, but because of paper shortages had never gotten around to publishing it, though they did many other of his novels, including the first 6 in the Amazon series. But after deciding to concentrate on non-fiction, they'd reverted the rights to Fern. But by that time, the science fiction boom in the UK was over, and the novel had languished unpublished. Gary and I were happy to redress this anomaly, and to make the book extra special, we added a bonus short story with a similar theme, After the Atom. The Sliverers, 1997, was the first American edition, if not strictly a world first. It had originally been written for the Toronto Star Weekly in 1959, when it had been rejected by their female editor as having too gruesome and unpleasant a theme. Humans having their minds absorbed and being replaced by alien lookalikes, as in a more famous The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. Fern had rewritten it, condensing it to less than half its length, into a novelette suitable for circulation to science fiction magazines, but it died in 1960 before he could sell it. The shorter manuscript had been passed to me by Fern's widow Carrie in 1970, when she'd appointed me as her literary agent. I immediately sold it to the UK magazine Vision of Tomorrow, which I also edited. We see it here. That's it, with a double-page spread by artist Eddie Jones, published in the September number 12 issue, 1970. I was then unaware of the existence of the original novel version, which I only discovered after his widow's death in 1982. In 1984, I'd attempted to publish it myself in a limited edition chapbook. I commissioned Ron Turner to do black and white illustrations for it, and had it professionally typeset, ready for photocopying. But unfortunately, the firm I chose botched the job. They managed to smear and thicken the typeface by photocopying it instead of reprinting it directly from my clean typesetting. I was so disappointed that I withdrew it after circulating only the pre-ordered copies. So this Gryphon edition was pretty much a world first edition. But the Ron Turner original drawings weren't lost, because I was able to reuse them in the book edition. There we are. And the book edition also had a bonus short story on a similar theme, Leeches from Space. And there we see the original Jack Binder, 1939 illustration. Here we see the first American editions of two of Fern's rarest books and personal favourites of mine, the Herbert the Dinosaur series. A Thing of the Past also contained the vintage short story, Through Earth's Core, and its sequel, The Genial Dinosaur, as I've said, now sported laminated covers. Now, Gary also published one issue of a new anthology, the Gryphon Science Fiction and Fantasy Reader. It included an article by Dick Lupoff and vintage and new short stories by American and British authors, including Jack Williamson, Ken Bulmer, Fern, Tubb and others, most of which I provided. It was a good idea, as were the stories, but unfortunately it had several printing errors and an amateurish inside layout, wherein Gary had omitted two Ron Turner illustrations I'd specially commissioned for Fern's story. So I was not inclined to continue the series. But this one-off is still a nice collector's item. Now in 1996, I'd been delighted to publish the first English language edition of a lost short novel written by E.C. Tubb in late 1954, but unsold in the UK because of the science fiction slump at that time. It had only ever been published in German. Originally entitled Greed, I retitled it to the more evocative Pandora's Box, and as a special book, it also had a unique hardcover edition. The only one on this series to have a hardcover edition. It was quickly followed by another lost 1954 Tubb novella, The Temple of Death, an action-packed adventure story that had never been published anywhere. It had originally been written for the Tidbits series, but was returned when that imprint folded. A much later novel we used was Footsteps of Angels. Footsteps of Angels. There we see that one there, in 2004. This was a superb adult novel, originally entitled Zip the Sun, had been written for Door Books in the late 1980s, but inexplicably rejected by the new regime following the death of Don Walheim. Tubb had then lost his long-time agent Les Flood, who retired, and his successor had failed to circulate it elsewhere, which was one reason why Tubb had sacked her and engaged me to represent him. For this world first edition, I used a recycled Sidney Jordan cover from New Worlds. But Jordan had also painted a new cover for this 2004 edition. This one of one of the 1950s vintage Tubb novels I chose to reprint, De Bracy's Drug. We see all the Tubb books here, all with new Turner covers. But the piece de resistance for Tubb collectors was this edition of The Return. This edition of The Return, 1997. At that time, the 32nd and thought to be the final Dumas novel, and one that had only ever been published in French. This book now fetches astronomical prices because it's never been reprinted in English, except as an e-book. The second copy we see here was one of the very few to have a laminated card cover. When Gary had rebound a few of his unsolds in 2001, I suspect that these no dust wrapper editions are now very rare indeed. Later, Tubb would eventually write the 33rd novel, Child of Earth, to conclude the series. In 2004, we reproduced John Glasby's ultra-rare book, Dark Centauri, the final science fiction novel published by John Spencer in 1954, before they created their later Badger Books imprint. Now, whilst my videos have concentrated on British science fiction, I've always been a fan of American science fiction since I was a boy. And I'd quickly amassed a large collection of American books and magazines. When I'd first encountered Gary in 1991, I'd already met and interviewed some famous American writers, most notably Edmund Hamilton and his wife Lee Brackett, when they'd visited the UK in 1964, and US editor Don Walheim, who I'd met at Oxford in 1969. And I'd long corresponded with American science fiction historians Sam Moscovich and Forrest G. Ackerman, who'd first written me in 1963 after seeing my first publication about John Russell Fearn. John Russell Fearn, An Evaluation. And I've been in contact with them ever since. I also met Forry Ackerman and Jack Williamson in 1970 at the World Science Fiction Convention held in Heidelberg, Germany, and I was also in correspondence with them. So when Gary told me he wanted to introduce American authors into the series, I was delighted and eagerly volunteered to write introductions to their American books and to get Ron Turner to illustrate them. The American novels Gary chose were all old classics from the pulp magazines, where some of them were serialized. They came from amazing stories, astounding stories, fantastic adventures, startling stories, with The Ruler of Fate and Xanadu coming from weird tales and wonder stories respectively. Here we see one of Turner's finest new covers illustrating Williamson's The Fortress of Utopia, 1999. It was also one of his last. Unfortunately, Turner had died in December 1998, but fortunately I had a stockpile of many unpublished, personally commissioned covers that I was able to use for all the later Gryphon books and other publishers too, like Wildside. I've shown some of these covers in my earlier videos. Williamson's first novel, The Stone from the Green Star, had been serialized in Amazing in 1931. In my introduction, I revealed evidence that indicated it had been the inspirational basis for the film Star Wars. I myself suggested running 2 Williamson serialized novellas from 1937 issues of Astounding Stories, and we collected them for the very first time in this 1997 book, The Blue Spot and Enterprise Reversed. Along with Tubbs' penultimate humorous novel, The Return, these Williamson first editions are perhaps the high spots of the entire Gryphon series. Equally iconic was Gary's first world edition of the complete The Whispering Gorilla. This contained the original 1940 story by Don Wilcox and its 1943 sequel, The Whispering Gorilla Returns, by a different author, David Verne. Both had originally appeared in Fantastic Adventures. And the Wilcox story had never been reprinted. The latter story had been reprinted, but only as a 1950 British pocketbook, which we see here. It's now a much sought after and expensive collector's item. My introduction revealed that Don Wilcox had not been aware of this edition, and that every science fiction encyclopedia and reference book had wrongly designated the 1950 book as being an expansion of his original story. So-called science fiction experts had done this without ever having seen or read the book, simply going by its truncated titles. All of the Fern and Tubb titles would much later go on to be republished by mainstream publishers, several in foreign translations. I believe the Williamson and Wilcox and Fern stories have also been reprinted in recent years, but since I was never contacted by the new publishers, I can only assume these later editions don't contain the background information I was able to unearth. Or maybe they do, without crediting Gary or myself. At any rate, I believe the Gryphon editions will be of more interest to collectors, especially since their initial print runs in the low hundreds were decimated when Gary's home was flooded by Hurricane Sandy, and many copies destroyed before they could be sold. Also of a special interest were several unique limited signed editions by author, artist and myself. Here we see the signed edition. It is. The Whispering Gorilla. Other signed edition was The Fortress of Utopia. Unique signed editions. What more could a collector want? I understand that Gary Levisi himself is also doing a video about this series on his own YouTube channel shortly after this one goes out. I've recommended his channel before, which Gary established a couple of years ago. On it, he's issued hundreds of entertaining videos covering every genre of book publishing. In fact, he directly inspired my own poor efforts. So if this video interested you, I would urge you to search out his channel to learn about these books from his American publisher perspective. And if you're very lucky, you may even be able to buy a few of them from him.